What's up, geeks and gamers? So, you think you know what the real Zelda timeline is? Last time we went over why the official timeline in the Hyrule Historia is an intentional fake by Nintendo. Click here if you haven't seen that yet. But then, what's the real timeline? If this isn't the true order of events, what is? Let's dive into the lore, the legends, and the logic of the Zelda franchise to unravel the mystery. And in case it's not obvious, spoilers ahead for basically the entire Zelda series. Let's start with the easy ones, the ones we know 100% for sure. We know that Adventure of Link is a direct sequel to the original Zelda, featuring the same Link since we're told as much in the game's manual. We also know that Majora's Mask is a direct sequel to Ocarina of Time, again featuring the same incarnation of Link in both games, with Link this time going to look for Navi after she flew away at the end of Ocarina of Time. We know Phantom Hourglass is a direct sequel to Wind Waker since it's the same Link and Zelda, aka Tetra in this case, and they're sailing off with Tetra's pirate crew to try and find a landmass large enough to start a new Hyrule Kingdom after the events of Wind Waker. We also know Spirit Tracks comes after that, since the backstory of Spirit Tracks tells us of Link and Tetra Zelda finding New Hyrule just as they were trying to do in Phantom Hourglass. Lastly, we know that Triforce Heroes is a direct sequel to A Link Between Worlds and features the same Link, since Nintendo explicitly confirmed this in a tweet about the games. So those are the ones where the connections between them are 100% confirmed. But from here on, we've got to do a little detective work. The main way we're going to determine the placement of each game is by comparing various elements of the games that give us an indication of whether a given game comes before or after another game. For instance, Ganondorf transforms into Ganon for the very first time during Ocarina of Time, so any game that features Ganon logically must come after. For another example, the Master Sword is created during the events of Skyward Sword, so any game where the Master Sword already exists must come after. On top of that, we'll be using in-game hints, Easter eggs, and bits of lore that various games give us to help narrow down the possibilities and form connections first between the individual games, then we'll sort those connected groups into the final timeline. Well, no better place to begin than at the beginning. The official timeline claims that Skyward Sword is the first game, but in reality, the first game in the timeline should be Minish Cap. How do we know? Well, for one thing, the backstory of Minish Cap tells us of the first time monsters ever appeared in Hyrule. At the start of the game, there are no monsters anywhere. The worst thing you'll encounter is a Deku Scrub, and they're not really monsters so much as they are nervous and bad with new people. It's only when Vaati opens the bound chest that monsters are once again released to terrorize Hyrule. Since every other game has these same monsters in them, those games logically have to come after the game where the monsters are first unleashed onto the world. For another, the Minish Cap reveals that the Armos, enemies which appear in every Zelda game except for Adventure of Link, Triforce Heroes, and Breath of the Wild, were created by the Minish. Logically, any game that has Armos has to come after that, right? And since the only 3 games that don't feature Armos all have other evidence that shows they don't come before Minish Cap, the only place Minish Cap can go is at the very beginning. Link also uses the Picori Sword throughout Minish Cap instead of the Master Sword. Why is that? If the world is in danger, why would you grab the broken Picori Sword and then spend all that time running all over trying to fix it so you have a weapon strong enough to defeat Vaati, rather than just going and grabbing the not broken and also much more powerful Master Sword? Even if the general public isn't aware of the existence of the Master Sword, the royal family most certainly would be. Yet nobody even considers the Master Sword as an option, or even mentions its existence. The most logical explanation for all this is that the Master Sword just doesn't exist yet, and if Minish Cap is the first game in the timeline, that makes perfect sense. Another small supporting detail is Link's iconic green cap. Every other game tells us that the legends have always described the hero as wearing a green tunic and green hat since ancient times. For every other game, the fact that the hero wears a green hat is something that has been known for centuries. But the prologue of the Minish Cap shows us that the very first hero, the hero of men, did not wear a green cap. We also know Link didn't wear a green cap in Minish Cap until he met Eslo. After that, every game tells us the hero always wears a green tunic and green cap. It seems to me that if every other game holds the green cap as an ancient legend, then the game where we first see Link get the green cap must come before those. So now we've got the placement of Minish Cap. Twilight Princess features Ganondorf, which means it must take place after Ocarina of Time, since we're told during Ocarina that Ganondorf was born sometime a few decades before the events of the game, the sole Gerudo male born every 100 years. But he hasn't yet turned into the Demon King Ganon, so it can't be on the adult timeline after Ocarina, since the adult timeline is what happens after adult Link defeats Ganon and then stays in the adult era with Zelda and rebuilds, rather than being sent back to his childhood. The child timeline is what happens when Zelda does send Link back to his childhood after he defeats Ganon, back to before he ever opened the door to the Sacred Realm and before Ganondorf ever touched the Triforce. Young Link then uses his knowledge of the future, together with young Zelda, to expose Ganondorf's plans before he can gain power and convince the king of the Gerudo's treachery. As a result, Ganondorf is sentenced to death, but just as he was being executed, his Triforce of Power awakened and the sages banished him to the Twilight Realm in an act of desperation. We were told all this during a flashback in Twilight Princess. So then, Twilight Princess has to take place on the child timeline. We already know that Majora's Mask takes place on the child timeline directly after Ocarina of Time, so Twilight Princess must take place sometime after that. We don't know exactly how long it is between Ganondorf's failed execution and the start of Twilight Princess, but we do know it's a different Link and Zelda from the one seen in Ocarina of Time, since the Link and Zelda and Twilight Princess had clearly never met before the start of the Twilight Invasion. So there must be at least one generation between the two games. From here, things get a little bit murkier. That being said, we can deduce that Link's Awakening comes after the Oracle's games, and is even a direct sequel featuring the same version of Link. It isn't as explicit as with the other sequels we've already covered, but the evidence is there if you know where to look. First, the backstory of Link's Awakening says that after defeating Ganon and saving Hyrule, Link traveled to a faraway land to train in anticipation of future threats. After his training in this faraway land was complete, he boarded a boat to sail back to Hyrule, but he encountered a storm and was sank. And where do we find Link in the Oracle's games? In a faraway land, namely either Holodrum or Labrynna, depending on whether you're playing Ages or Seasons. And what do we see Link do in the true ending of the Oracle's games? Board a boat to head back home. In fact, it's the same boat we see get caught in a storm in the opening cutscene of Link's Awakening. The mast is the same, the length of the boat is the same, the shape is the same, they even have the same rope running from the same point on the mast to the same point on the front of the boat. The only difference is that the boat in Link's Awakening has its sails rolled up, and that's simply because you don't leave your sails unfurled during a storm. I mean, we're talking nearly pixel for pixel perfect match here. The depiction of Link himself is practically identical as well. If you play the Oracle's cutscene and then the Link's Awakening cutscene one right after the other and showed it to someone who hadn't played the games before, they'd think both cutscenes were from the same game. One game begins exactly where the other two end. That's about as strong a connection as you could ask for. Next, we have A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. First, the prologue to A Link Between Worlds, I think, is pretty clearly meant to be a summary of the events of A Link to the Past. Second, we have the paintings in A Link Between Worlds Hyrule Castle, which again clearly describe the previous game. Third, at one point in A Link Between Worlds, Sahasrara, yes, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, describes the events of A Link to the Past. There's even footage from a Nintendo Direct video of additional dialogue where he goes as far as mentioning Aghanim, and says it took place in the days of my grandfather's grandfather's grandfather. Though this particular bit of dialogue was cut from the game, its existence clearly indicates that it takes place after A Link to the Past. Along with this footage, Satoru Iwata himself explicitly tells us this game is set many years after Ganon was sealed in A Link to the Past. Compared to A Link to the Past, A Link Between Worlds takes place far in the future. That means the main character is not the same Link from A Link to the Past, but an entirely new Link. Then there's Gramps, an old man who manages the Street Pass functionality of the game, but can also be fought as an optional super boss. Gramps is heavily implied to be an older version of Link, as he wields the Master Sword, a Hylian shield, wears a green tunic, and has access to every item and bit of gear that the player does. Some people say he's specifically meant to be the Link from A Link to the Past, but this is a bit hard to believe due to the fact that Gramps is said to be 80, while A Link Between Worlds is implied to take place more than 100 years after A Link to the Past. Regardless of the true identity of Gramps, the point is A Link Between Worlds comes after A Link to the Past. And since we already covered Triforce Heroes coming after A Link Between Worlds, we can link all three of those up. Next up, we have Breath of the Wild, which goes after Twilight Princess. Now at first, Breath of the Wild appears to break the timeline completely because it paradoxically contains both Rito and Zora at the same time. In Wind Waker, where we are first introduced to the Rito, we're told the Zora couldn't survive after the Great Flood because the water of the new massive global ocean was too different from the water they were used to. As a result, they evolved into the Rito, trading life in the water for life in the sky. In other words, if the Rito are present, that means the Zora shouldn't be. There's also the Koroks, which evolved from the Kokiri in response to the Great Flood. Both of these things seem to suggest that Breath of the Wild takes place after Wind Waker. However, Wind Waker is on the adult timeline, and in one of Link's memories, Breath of the Wild Zelda explicitly mentions the events of Twilight Princess, which is on the child timeline. In addition, the Master Sword ends up lost at the bottom of the ocean at the end of Wind Waker, and yet Link has it during Breath of the Wild. Being after Wind Waker would also mean it'd have to be after Spirit Tracks, given that Breath of the Wild doesn't take place on a tiny island. And yet if it was after Spirit Tracks, there would be train tracks crisscrossing all over Hyrule. At first glance, it seems Breath of the Wild doesn't fit anywhere on the timeline. Zelda referencing Twilight Princess means it has to be on the child timeline, but the Rito and Koroks being present makes that seem impossible. However, there is one thing that allows Breath of the Wild to fit: time. And lots of it. It's stated that the last time Calamity Ganon showed up was at least 10,000 years before the events of Breath of the Wild, so we know it's been at least that long since Twilight Princess. It could have been much longer, but 10,000 is the minimum. For all we know, there could be anywhere from a few days to a few million years between the end of Twilight Princess and the last time Calamity Ganon attacked before Breath of the Wild. 10,000 years or more is plenty of time for the Kokiri to evolve into the Koroks, and for some of the Zora to evolve into the Ritos, while others evolve to be more shark-like, even without the Great Flood to act as a catalyst. If you notice, in Breath of the Wild, everyone treats Calamity Ganon like a natural disaster or a force of nature or pure hatred and malice or just a thing, rather than a person or a thinking intelligent entity. They never once refer to Ganon as him or he, always as it. They also never say just Ganon. It's always Calamity Ganon, or sometimes just the Calamity. Given that it's been at least tens of thousands of years since the events of Twilight Princess and Ocarina of Time, it's possible the people of Hyrule just forgot that Ganon was once a normal person. At one point, Urbosa says that the Calamity took the form of a Gerudo, but it sounds like she thinks it was a trick, like she doesn't know that he really was a Gerudo from the start. It's been so long since Ganondorf was a person that detail has been lost and ceased to be part of his legend. So that's most of the games connected to at least one other game. Now it's time to place all these groups on the final timeline. Like we already said, Minish Cap goes at the very beginning. Ocarina of Time goes right before the timeline split, since it's the game where the timeline split occurs. Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Breath of the Wild go after Ocarina of Time on the child branch of the timeline. Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks go after Ocarina on the adult timeline way at the end. A Link to the Past must come after Ocarina of Time on the adult timeline because it features Ganon, and we already figured out that A Link to the Past is followed by A Link Between Worlds and Triforce Heroes. We can deduce that the Oracles and Link's Awakening come after this chain of A Link to the Past, A Link Between Worlds, and Triforce Heroes. Link's Awakening's backstory says he went on a journey to train after destroying Ganon. We already established that the journey he went on was the events of the Oracles games, but in this case, we're interested in the other part of that backstory. He went on that journey after destroying Ganon. That means this journey took place after one of the games, or at least one of the chains of games, where he fights Ganon. Our options there are either Ocarina of Time, this group of games comprised of A Link to the Past, A Link Between Worlds, and Triforce Heroes, or the original two Zeldas. However, given the fact that it says Link went on his journey after destroying Ganon, we can eliminate Ocarina of Time since he only sealed Ganon at the end of that game. And between the remaining two choices, the original two Zeldas seem unlikely, as Link is clearly much older in The Adventure of Link than he is in the Oracles games or Link's Awakening. So by process of elimination, the Oracles games and Link's Awakening go here. If you're wondering why placing it after Twilight Princess or Breath of the Wild aren't options, Link doesn't destroy Ganon at the end of Twilight Princess, he destroys Ganondorf. And it can't be after Breath of the Wild because that Link was Zelda's appointed knight, so he wouldn't be able to leave and go on a journey to train even if he wanted to. Not to mention, he pretty clearly would have had to stay with Zelda and help rebuild. Next up, we need to place the original two Zeldas, and it basically comes down to either being after Ocarina of Time or after Link's Awakening. The game manuals for the original two games tell us that prior to the events of the original Legend of Zelda, the royal family had possession of the full Triforce, with the Triforce of Power and Triforce of Wisdom being handed down from generation to generation, and the Triforce of Courage locked away in secret in the Great Palace. They also tell us that Ganon attacked the peaceful little kingdom and stole the Triforce of Power from them. This clearly wasn't the case for the royal family after Ocarina of Time, as Ganon already possessed the Triforce of Power while locked away in the Sacred Realm, so it wouldn't be possible for him to steal it. Further, the Triforce of Courage was bound to the spirit of the hero and not locked away in the Great Palace. After this group of games, on the other hand, the royal family did have the full Triforce. At the end of A Link Between Worlds, Zelda takes possession of the complete Triforce and uses it to restore Lorule. We don't see the royal family lose possession of the Triforce during Triforce Heroes, the Oracles games, or Link's Awakening, so after A Link Between Worlds, the royal family would indeed have had possession of the full Triforce, making it possible for it to be handed down from generation to generation until the events of the original Legend of Zelda, where Ganon stole back the Triforce of Power. Four Swords would have to come after Minish Cap, since the Four Sword itself is clearly an upgraded version of the Picori Sword. In addition, the main villain of Minish Cap, Vaati, returns as the villain of Four Swords. Skyward Sword is when the Master Sword is created, so it has to go before any games where the Master Sword already exists, which includes Ocarina of Time. And since the Knight's uniform given to students at Skyloft Academy is clearly based on the hero's clothes and includes the green cap, it must come after Minish Cap. This leaves only one location. Lastly, there's Four Swords Adventures. Now obviously it has to go after Four Swords, but it also contains Ganon, so it has to come after Ocarina of Time. On the surface, it looks like this one could fit lots of places, but there are a few key details that show it can only fit in between Link's Awakening and the original Legend of Zelda. For one, Ganon starts off as Ganondorf in this game and has to steal the Dark Trident in order to achieve his full power. This is because at the end of A Link Between Worlds, Link and Zelda take possession of the full Triforce after defeating you, Ganon, meaning Ganon no longer has the Triforce of Power and can no longer achieve his powerful Demon King form. This placement is also supported by the fact that Ganon didn't have the Triforce of Power at the beginning of the original Legend of Zelda. He had to steal it away from the royal family. Another detail is the fact that Four Swords Adventures features the Dark Mirror, which is used to create Shadow Links. Note that there is a difference between Shadow Links and Dark Links. Dark Links are seen to be created in a number of different ways and usually just mirror the real Link's movements. Shadow Links, on the other hand, can only be created by the Dark Mirror and are fully autonomous Samus and much stronger than Dark Links. During the course of Four Swords Adventures, you battle and defeat multiple Shadow Links. However, in the Adventure of Link, a Shadow Link is the main villain trying to revive Ganon. Where did that Shadow Link come from if not from Ganon using the Dark Mirror during Four Swords Adventures? If Four Swords Adventures isn't located here on the timeline, then that means this Shadow Link has been hanging around in secret and doing nothing for hundreds of years. It's much more likely that it was created during Four Swords Adventures, fled when Ganon was defeated so it could try to revive him later, and made its move during the Adventure of Link. So there we have it, every Zelda game so far put in order and definitively placed on their correct locations on the timeline by cold hard facts. Every connection here is pretty rock solid, and sorry if I sound like I'm bragging, but I'm honestly pretty proud of this one. It took a lot of work, and I think I really have deciphered the one true, factually proven order of the games. But I'm sure that's not going to stop the internet from tearing me a new one, so let's hear it. Comment below and tell me all the things I got wrong and why I'm a big dumb idiot who knows nothing about Zelda. Or, you know, nice things. You could comment nice things if you wanted. I spent a lot of time researching this and working on everything, so getting your feedback would be appreciated. And if you like this video, consider subscribing and hitting the bell so you don't miss my next one. Want more like this? Check out my previous video detailing why the quote-unquote official timeline is an intentional fake by Nintendo. Anyway, thanks for watching. This has been So You Think You Know, and now you do know.